James Earl Carter, Jr., more commonly known as Jimmy Carter, was born on a small peanut farm in Georgia on October 1, 1924. His mother's rejection of racism influenced his later political beliefs, and he was the first on his father's side to graduate from high school. Graduating from the Naval Academy in 1946, Carter married high school acquaintance Rosalind Smyth before entering 7 years of service with the Navy. In 1966, Jimmy Carter ran for governor of Georgia, but his liberal stance alienated the majority of Georgia's voters. Frustrated with his defeat, Carter ran again in 1970 under a more conservative facade and won.
And it was the working people, not the special interests, that Jimmy Carter represented as governor of the largest state east of the Mississippi. He gave them an administration responsive to their needs and proved that an efficient and well-managed government can be achieved.
In 1974, Jimmy Carter began his 2-year campaign for presidency. He ran as the Democratic Party's nominee against the current president, Gerald R. Ford. Calling himself an outsider to Washington, D.C., Carter promised transparency, honesty, and integrity, appealing to Americans' frustration with a secretive and corrupt government. 2 years later, Jimmy Carter was elected the 39th president.
I have a vision of America, a vision that has grown and ripened as I've traveled and talked and listened and learned and gotten to know the people of this country. I see an America poised not only at the beginning of a new century, but at the brink of a long new era of more effective and efficient and sensitive and competent government.
Hoping to lead the country and government by example, Carter promised to never tell a lie. Unfortunately, his truth-telling and transparency led to several scandals within his personal life and administration. Nevertheless, Carter's high moral principles were reflected in his foreign policy, which focused on peacemaking and diplomacy. Going against the American public's opinion, Carter returned the Panama Canal to Panama in 1977. He extended diplomatic relations to China while breaking ties with Taiwan, and ratified the SALT II treaties with the Soviet Union. Carter helped to mediate the Camp David peace agreements between Egypt and Israel in 1978, while withholding aid from several South American countries whose governments were abusing the human rights of their citizens.
Within the U.S., Carter also worked to lower unemployment and increase government efficiency, successfully creating 8 million jobs and decreasing the budget deficit. As part of his liberal social reforms, Carter created the Department of Education, financially reinforced Social Security, and appointed record numbers of women and minorities to government jobs. In an era of rising energy costs and inflation, Carter also focused on conserving energy and resources. He established the Department of Energy to find alternative, sustainable energy sources and preserved 103 million acres of Alaskan land under the National Park Program. Nevertheless, America was still largely dependent upon OPEC for petroleum at the time. When OPEC almost tripled its oil prices, Carter was unable to stop American inflation, triggering an economic recession.
Despite Carter's successes, he was widely disliked by the end of his presidency. He spoke of America's crisis of confidence, seemingly blaming the recession on Americans' lack of morale. His final year as president was tarnished by the Iranian hostage crisis, during which Iranian students, angered by America's involvement in their country, seized the United States Embassy in Iran, taking hostages for 444 days. They were finally released on the day of President Reagan's inauguration.
The public's lasting opinion of Carter was one of incompetence and ineffectiveness. He constantly warred with Congress, sending liberal reforms that were rejected by his more conservative fellow Democrats, yet was unwilling to compromise this legislation. His failed attempt at rescuing the hostages in Iran was criticized until his last day in office, and his international work for peace and human rights often seemed to go against American interests. Nevertheless, Carter continued a successful career in diplomacy and human rights advocacy after he left office, culminating in winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002 for his part in the Camp David talks and in founding the Carter Center.